There is an old Confucian saying that the strategists in Washington seem to have forgotten, a warning passed down through centuries of conflict and power struggles, a simple but brutal truth about human nature and empire, which says that before you embark on a journey of revenge, you should dig two graves, one for your enemy and one for yourself. Because vengeance has a way of circling back on those who believe they control it. And for the past 3 years, the United States has been on precisely such a journey it prefers to dress up with clean language and academic phrasing, calling it strategic competition, calling it de-risking, calling it national security. But strip away the euphemisms, and what remains is far more direct and far more dangerous, an attempt to strangle the Chinese economy by cutting off the oxygen of technology, an attempt to freeze a rival nation in place by denying it access to the tools of the future, and in October of 2022, that attempt escalated dramatically when the Biden administration launched what many inside the tech industry quietly described as the nuclear option, a sweeping set of export controls designed to ban the sale of the world's most advanced semiconductors to China, while also blocking access to the machines, software, and expertise needed to manufacture them. A move that effectively told the world that China would be allowed to go no further, that the United States held the keys to the future and intended to lock the door. And inside the corridors of power, this move was celebrated as a masterstroke, as a decisive checkmate that would halt China's technological rise in its tracks, with policymakers convinced that without American chips, and especially without the high-powered AI processors designed by NVIDIA, China's ambitions would collapse under their own weight. But fast forward to today, and that celebration has curdled into anxiety and quiet panic because the CEOs of America's most powerful technology companies are no longer smiling. They are flying to Washington behind closed doors, warning the White House that the sanctions did not break China, they are breaking us. And what we are witnessing now is one of the greatest boomerang effects in modern economic history, a case study in how weaponizing interdependence can backfire spectacularly, because the policy designed to cripple China's tech sector has instead accelerated its independence, while simultaneously hollowing out the very companies it was meant to protect. And to understand why this outcome was almost inevitable, you first need to understand the basic business model of Silicon Valley, because companies like NVIDIA, Intel, and AMD do not manufacture chips themselves at scale, they design them, and that design process is brutally expensive, requiring tens of billions of dollars in research and development just to stay competitive. And that money does not come from thin air, it comes from sales. And for more than a decade, the single most important customer in the semiconductor market has been China, a country that consumes more than half of the world's chips, making it not a side market, but the central pillar of global demand. And for NVIDIA in particular, China has historically represented roughly 20 to 30% of total revenue, not a luxury, but the engine that keeps the lights on. So when Washington cut off that market, it did not merely punish China. It effectively confiscated nearly a third of Silicon Valley's income stream and set it ablaze, all while assuming that innovation would somehow continue unaffected, an assumption rooted in the same arrogance that underpinned the sanctions against Russian energy, where Western leaders believed Russia would collapse without European buyers, only to discover that Russia simply rerouted its exports, while Europe absorbed the shock in the form of soaring energy prices and industrial decline. And now the same mistake is being repeated with semiconductors, because by cutting NVIDIA off from its largest customer, the United States has undermined the funding base that makes NVIDIA's innovation possible, a reality NVIDIA's own CEO has warned about publicly when he explained that without access to global markets, no amount of domestic subsidies can sustain leadership. But the error runs even deeper than lost revenue, because when you deny a vital product to a major power, you do not force surrender, you force substitution. And in doing so, the United States shattered what had been its greatest source of leverage, the golden handcuffs of dependency. Because as long as China could buy cheap, reliable, high-quality American chips, it had little incentive to build its own alternatives, leaving the United States in a position of quiet but overwhelming power. Yet the moment those sales were banned, China was given no choice but to go all in on domestic production, to pour unprecedented resources into building an independent semiconductor ecosystem, and the results of that forced mobilization are now impossible to ignore, with the most symbolic moment arriving on August 29th, 2023, when the U.S. Commerce Secretary was visiting Beijing under the assumption that American sanctions had crippled China's ability to produce advanced technology, only for Huawei to quietly release the Mate 60 Pro on the same day, a phone that when dismantled revealed a 7-nanometer chip manufactured domestically, shattering years of confident assertions from Western analysts that China was a decade behind and incapable of progress without American tools, because that phone did more than prove technical capability. It exposed the fatal flaw in the sanction strategy by demonstrating that pressure had not stopped development. It had redirected it, and the psychological impact of this cannot be overstated, because before the sanctions, Huawei was merely a successful company integrated into the global system, reliant on American software and chips. But once it was targeted, it became a national symbol, a rallying point that justified massive state intervention, turning what had been a commercial challenge into a national mission, drawing top engineers away from consumer apps and toward deep technological bottlenecks like lithography and chip architecture, effectively creating a semiconductor Manhattan Project that the United States itself unintentionally subsidized through its own restrictions. And this shift marks the beginning of a far more consequential retaliation, not one measured in tariffs or press releases, but in substitution, as China systematically removes American technology from its critical systems, issuing directives to replace Intel and AMD processors in government computers and servers with domestic alternatives, wiping out a market that once generated billions in revenue and will never return. Because once trust is broken at this scale, it does not regenerate. And China has learned the core lesson the United States inadvertently taught it, that reliance equals vulnerability. And that lesson now guides procurement decisions where security of supply outweighs marginal performance advantages, even if American chips remain faster in some benchmarks, because a chip that can be turned off by a foreign signature is not a strategic asset but a liability. And this is where the long-term damage becomes irreversible, because the United States traded a short-term slowdown for a permanent loss, sacrificing decades of market dominance to delay a competitor by a handful of years, while simultaneously accelerating the creation of a parallel technological ecosystem that will not only serve China but increasingly appeal to the global south. And nowhere is this dynamic more dangerous than in the case of NVIDIA, the company currently propping up much of the US stock market's optimism, because while NVIDIA's flagship AI chips are coveted globally, they are forbidden from being sold to China, forcing the company into a precarious compromise where it designs intentionally weakened products to comply with export rules, a strategy that might have worked when China had no alternatives, but fails completely once domestic competitors reach parity. And that is exactly what has happened, as Chinese firms increasingly reject downgraded American chips in favor of domestic options that offer comparable performance without political risk, creating a feedback loop that erodes NVIDIA's market share while simultaneously undermining its greatest advantage, its software ecosystem, because as Chinese developers move away from NVIDIA hardware, they are also moving away from its software platforms, breaking a lock-in effect that once seemed unassailable. And this is the nightmare scenario for Silicon Valley, a world where American technology is no longer the default standard, but one option among many, because the assumption that US technology is irreplaceable has been exposed as historical hubris, since technology does not freeze, it flows, adapting to pressure and rerouting around obstacles, and the sanctions did not halt China's progress in artificial intelligence. They simply diverted it into a separate channel beyond American influence, raising profound questions about whether this strategy has actually made the United States safer, or whether it has instead weakened its own champions while forcing its rival to achieve self-sufficiency in the most critical technologies of the 21st century. And as the world now splits into competing technological spheres with different standards, supply chains, and systems, it becomes increasingly clear that this is not about isolation of China, but fragmentation of the global economy, because much of the world is not interested in ideological crusades. It is interested in affordable, reliable infrastructure. And if Chinese technology offers comparable capability without political strings attached, many countries will choose it, not out of loyalty, but out of pragmatism. And when historians look back on this moment, they may not see a bold act of strategic foresight, but the inflection point where the United States willingly surrendered its technological monopoly by confusing control with power, because in trying to break China's legs, it may have only succeeded in teaching China how to run faster, farther, and eventually without looking back. And now we arrive at the part of the story that most commentators are still afraid to confront, because it forces a reckoning not just with China's rise, but with America's own strategic culture, a culture that has grown addicted to sanctions as a substitute for strategy, mistaking leverage for control and coercion for foresight, because what the semiconductor war reveals is not simply a miscalculation, but a deeper flaw in how power is understood in Washington, where policymakers increasingly assume that dominance in one era automatically translates into dominance in the next, ignoring the fact that technological leadership is not a static asset, but a dynamic process that must be continuously earned, funded, and trusted. And trust is the one currency the United States has burned at an alarming rate, because by openly weaponizing supply chains, it has sent a message to every country on Earth that American technology comes with political conditions that can change overnight, that contracts are provisional, that access is contingent not on market logic but on geopolitical alignment. And once that message is absorbed, it does not just affect China, it reshapes global behavior, because every rational actor now has to ask the same question China asked in 2022. What happens if we are next? What happens if a future disagreement turns our critical infrastructure into a bargaining chip? And that question alone is enough to drive diversification away from American platforms, even among allies, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of self-preservation, because no modern economy can afford to have its data centers, communications networks, or AI systems subject to foreign veto. And this is why the fragmentation we are seeing now is not temporary, but structural, because once parallel ecosystems begin to form, they take on a life of their own, attracting talent, capital, and innovation that no longer flows through Silicon Valley by default. And this is already visible in how Chinese firms are approaching global markets, not by trying to outcompete the United States at the very top of the performance curve, but by offering systems that are good enough, cheaper, and politically neutral, a combination that is often far more attractive than raw speed, especially for countries that care more about reliability and sovereignty than shaving milliseconds off inference time. And this is the cruel irony of the entire strategy, because in trying to deny China the cutting edge, the United States has incentivized China to dominate the middle, the vast expanse of global demand, where most users actually live. And once that middle is captured, it becomes a launch pad for future advances, because scale itself is a form of power, generating data, feedback, and revenue that can be reinvested into higher-end capabilities. And this is precisely how American tech companies rose in the first place, by serving global markets broadly, rather than hoarding access narrowly. And yet Washington now seems determined to reverse that logic, even as the costs become impossible to hide. Because when NVIDIA, Intel, and other firms warn that they are being squeezed from both sides, losing Chinese customers while facing subsidized competitors abroad, they are not engaging in lobbying theatrics. They are describing a structural erosion of the ecosystem that made American dominance possible, an ecosystem built on openness, scale, and global integration, all of which are now being sacrificed in the name of an ill-defined security logic that assumes technological stagnation is a viable long-term outcome for a civilization of over 1 billion people. And history offers no example where such an assumption has held, because pressure does not eliminate ambition, it concentrates it. And when ambition is backed by resources, talent, and time, the outcome is rarely submission. More often it is transformation. And this is why the most dangerous consequence of the tech war may not be economic at all, but psychological. Because the United States has unintentionally unified Chinese political, corporate, and public opinion around technological self-reliance as a matter of national survival, turning what might have been an uneven, market-driven evolution into a disciplined, state-supported campaign with clear objectives and long horizons. And campaigns like that do not dissolve when quarterly earnings fluctuate. They persist until the goal is achieved. And once achieved, they permanently alter the balance of power, because a China that can design, manufacture, and deploy its own advanced chips, software stacks, and AI systems is not just harder to pressure, it is fundamentally freer in its strategic choices, and that freedom reduces the effectiveness of every future sanction, every threat of exclusion, every attempt to coerce behavior through access denial, meaning that the very tool Washington now relies on most is being dulled by overuse. And the final irony is that this outcome was avoidable because integration creates influence, while isolation breeds alternatives, and the United States once understood this instinctively during its own rise, when access to markets, not embargoes, fueled leadership. But somewhere along the way, that lesson was forgotten, replaced by the belief that dominance could be frozen in time through regulation. And as this belief collides with reality, the costs will not be paid all at once, but gradually, in lost market share, in diminished standards, setting power, in ecosystems that grow elsewhere, while America watches from behind its own walls. And by the time this becomes obvious to everyone, the transition will already be complete. Because technological power, once seated, does not announce its departure. It simply stops returning.